progress.
Hey, good morning to you, Dr. Dada. Such a pleasure having you here. Can you hear me? Am I audible to you?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning. I'm
Great.
just checking the connection.
Yeah, great, great. I
You
actually,
can hear me okay?
yes, this is all good. This is all good.
Good. Then I'm going to share my screen. Just make sure you can see my slides, please.
Yeah, this is good. This is you. You can
Okay.
make it
If I
full screen once we
if,
go ahead. Yeah.
if I put them on slideshow, is this better?
Yes. Yes.
Better like this. Okay. Great. So I'll stop sharing. I'll do it later on. That's good. All works.
So how are you today? It's such a pleasure having you for this class, Dr. Zitouni.
Thank you. I'm fine. And you?
So this is all good. We were just waiting and looking forward to have this masterclass with you because I already am quite aware about the kind of conferences you're attending. I knew that this is going to be a great master class today with Dr. Zutuni. I was very sure about this. Yeah.
I hope so. I hope so. Looking forward to it. Yeah. So you're going to introduce the master class? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Good. And then for the questions, you will manage that.
Yeah. So this is
Excellent.
this. Yeah. This would be the format, Dr. Zutuni. We are going to have a 60 minutes masterclass, and then after that, it would be followed by a 30 minutes Q&A session with all our audience who to join us today.
Excellent. That sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So I think yes, we still have some time.
Yes, I just wanted to check. So I'll log out and then log in again in 5 minutes.
Sure, sure. No problem.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay,
Yes.
just to
Thank you.
tidy up a few things. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll
Great.
be back
Great.
shortly then.
See you soon. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this masterclass today. This is another session of a great masterclass with, of course, none other than Dr. Zitouni Ould-Dada today, and we are more than happy joined by him today for this masterclass. So once again, good morning and welcome, Dr. Zitouni. This is such a pleasure having you for this masterclass today. And just a quick introduction, I'm Tolika. I'm a senior manager with Edorer. This class, the topic of today's class is what's challenging global food security. And I just welcome Dr. Zitouni once again because we all were waiting for this class, of course, and I know it's going to be a great class today. Dr. Zitouni, I would be introducing you. This is going to be the format. Actually, we'll have a 1 hour session with you and then followed by 30 minutes question and answer round. And yes, once I just introduce you to all the audience with all the accolades we have to introduce you for have here. It is a pleasure once again to have you for the class.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and it's really a pleasure to take part and give this lecture, and very much looking forward to it.
Okay, so let me share a quick introduction here with everyone about Dr. Zitouni, and then we can move forward with the class. Can you see my screen? Okay. So we're delighted to have Dr. Zitouni Ould-Dada today for this masterclass. Dr. Ould-Dada has 27 years international experience working with the United Nations and the governments of the United Kingdom and France in high-profile policy areas, including climate change, food security, energy security, and sustainable development. He participated in 14 international climate change conferences, where he held various roles, including chair of negotiations, lead negotiator on climate and technology for the UK and France, UN delegate, moderator, and speaker. His diplomatic leadership and achievements in climate negotiations contributed to the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. In his latest role of Deputy Director at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, he played a leading role in raising the importance of addressing the climate food security crisis and driving forward the transformation of global agri food systems. He was also a member of many UN task forces established by the UN Secretary General, including for advancing climate action, food systems transformation, and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Before joining FAO in 2018, he was head of technology unit at the United Nations Environment Program for 5 years, leading work on the global development of low carbon technologies to address climate change, energy security, and sustainable development. Before joining the UN in 2013, he held several senior positions in the UK government, including at Department of Energy and Climate Change, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Food Standards Agency, Environment Agency, and Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. He also worked for the French government on international climate change during the France presidency of the European Union in 2008. Dr. Ould-Dada is internationally renowned and a trusted collaborative leader amongst the global climate change and agriculture development communities. He is a respected advocate and global voice for the solutions to climate change, food security, and sustainability, with a proven track record of delivering successful collaborative partnerships and initiatives. So yes, this is all about and much more about Dr. Zitouni Ould-Dada. And we are delighted to have you for this masterclass, Dr. Dada. The stage is all yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And welcome everyone to this lecture. And thank you very much for joining us. I'm delighted to talk about the challenges facing global food security and the solution that we need to put in place to ensure that we have a world that is food secured both now and for future generations. So at the end of this lecture, what I would like you to learn from this is the big picture about the crises that we are facing and also the drivers to global food security, and also how agriculture is at the same time a source of greenhouse gas emissions, so it does impact on climate change. And at the same time, climate change impacts agriculture. So agriculture is vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And then I'll talk also about the international efforts, how the international community is dealing with these crises and trying to address the global food security. And with that, I'll show you some figures on hunger and obesity around the world, and also what kind of initiatives and policies are being put by government to address this. And then I'll finish with some reflection, and hopefully you can join in as well with regard to the future of food, based on what we're facing and the challenges we need to address and the growing population. How do we see the future of food? How do we imagine it? How it should be so that we can ensure global food security? And then after that, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So feel free to ask your questions or make comments. So it would be good really to hear from you as well and hear your perspective. So there are really many crises, unfortunately, that they are facing us. We've been living through a succession of crises, not just climate change. As you have seen, climate change is all around us, is affecting every part of the world, and it does impact heavily on our food systems and livelihood. Combined with that, we also have the biodiversity loss and how ecosystem degradation again is happening all around the world and is affecting the soil quality, is affecting the yield of crops and food security. Sadly, we've seen also, at least in the last 20 years, an increase in wars and conflicts around the world. And that affects many communities, particularly vulnerable communities, causing displacement of communities. And that's again affecting the food supply, access to food, and food security. And hunger around the world is increasing, sadly. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen an increase in hunger. We now have about 733 million people who go hungry every day. And if we continue with the same, excuse me, with the same trend, even by 2030, we expect to still have around 600 million who will still be facing hunger. Not to forget the COVID-19. It was important in terms of causing hunger, unfortunately, because it did push 122 million additional people into hunger. So all these crises, what they have in common is one thing, which is they all impact food security, unfortunately. And you can see these crises, they're acting in connection in the way that actually is making food security worse around the world. So the community from all around the world started looking first as one of the key drivers, which is climate change and how climate change is affecting food production and our food security. And in 2015, they've agreed the Paris Agreement to limit the rise of global temperature to 1.5 degrees C. This is a clear goal going forward by the end of the century. And this goal means that by staying below 1.5 degrees C, we will avoid the danger of climate change. Anything above that, it would be risky, not just in terms of food security, but in terms of our lives in general, because it will really affect the way we live and how we use natural resources. And in the same year, 2015, the international community also agreed what we call the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see there, that they cover poverty and hunger, education, water, sanitation, life on land, climate action, energy, all the sustainable development goals that we want to see to make our life better by 2030 and to tackle these challenges. And you can see there, SDG 13 is on climate action and is connected, obviously, to many of these SDGs. But to put the food security in context, these SDGs, they cover three main aspects: the economic, the environmental, and social aspects. And you can see how these SDG are divided. But certainly in terms of biosphere and environmental aspect, that's really the basis. If we don't have a good environment, if we don't have a good biodiversity, a good soil that is healthy, that can provide us with the nutrients needed to grow our food, if we don't have a good water quality, the rest will be affected, society and economy. So it's important really to bear that in mind. And if we look closely at all these SDGs and where does food and agriculture matters fits in, so you can see that food and agriculture is linked to every single SDG, from ending hunger to poverty, responding to climate change, having access to renewable energy, and also protecting our natural resources. Every aspect here, you have food and agriculture that lies into that. So this is the big picture to understand where food and agriculture fits in and where the international agreements also are coming to emphasize this and make sure we have clear goals going forward. We also now living in a decade of action to deliver these goals. As I said, the goals are there to be achieved by 2030. So we have 6 years basically to transform our world and achieve these goals. Unfortunately, we're not advancing at the speed and scale required. We're not achieving most of these SDGs, and we can talk about that later on during the discussion, perhaps in more detail, but we're not on track to achieve them. We need to really accelerate the deployment of solutions that we need. So we're not doing that fast enough. The challenges that I mentioned, the crises, they are faster than our actions and our policies. And if we look at the scientific evidence from all around the world, these are all the scientists that sit at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, that look at the state of our climate and give advice to policymakers and recommendation on what we should do. And you can see there have been series of reports by the IPCC warning about the impact of the 1.5 degrees C and what we need to stay below that, looking at different aspects of our lives, from land, the atmosphere, also the oceans, and how these are changing. The main message to get from this is that a warming for more than 2 degrees C is likely to cause sustained food supply disruption globally. So when this leads to declined yields of our crops, that means that will affect prices. It will increase the prices of commodities and of our food. It will affect nutrition uptake in our food, and it will lead to increased hunger. So basically, climate change is a serious threat to our global food security. And it's not just about food production and it's about hunger, it's also about nutrition. And here you can see an estimate of how climate change will affect food production, how food production will drop at a global scale for some of the major crops that we are using. And we've seen this already happening this year. Some of you may have heard how climate change has affected the supply and the prices of olive oil, because olive crops have been affected in many parts of the world, particularly Spain, Morocco, Italy, Greece, and that led to a surge in prices of olive oil. And the supply diminished and the price has gone up, and the prices now are really very high for olive oil, just as an example. But there are effects also for cocoa, for coffee, and other commodities. Now, if we look at the interaction between agriculture and climate change, agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. As you can see there, all the sectors of the economy, agriculture and land use is about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. But when we include the whole food system, not just agricultural land use, but also the processing, the transport, the consumption, then these agri-food systems contribute a third of greenhouse gas emissions, a third of the global greenhouse gas emissions. You can see it's huge, and there is a huge potential there to change this. If we look closely at this third of greenhouse gas emissions in the agri-food systems, you can see that we have about 15 or 14% of the total emissions, of these total emissions, they occur at the farm gate, in the farm, all the activities related to farming, and about 10% that's happening pre and post production before, in terms of input bringing to the farm, and also after the food is being produced on farm. And then the land use changes about 6%. So this is to show you that agriculture is a significant contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. At the same time, agriculture is the sector the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, particularly when we consider drought. You can see in the graph here on the right-hand side, you have drought, floods, extreme weather, earthquake, pests, and other diseases. But drought comes up really at the top. It does affect agriculture a lot. In fact, 34% of the crops and livestock production loss is affected by drought. And you can see there the figures really speak for themselves. So the point I'm making here is that agriculture is very vulnerable to the impact of climate change. It does affect climate change, and climate change affects it in return. And that's very important to understand in terms of global food security and how we go forward to address this interconnection. There's so many things that we need to fix. There's so many things that we need to change. And if we look at the challenges, there's so many contradictions in the way we grow, we process, and consume food. First of all, if you look at it in terms of intake, you can see there is a large amount of land that is used just to produce our food, 40%. And as I said, a third of greenhouse gas emissions come from the way we grow, process, and consume food. And in terms of water consumption, again, the sector is a big consumer of water. 70% of withdrawn water is consumed in a way we grow our food, for agriculture in general. In terms of livestock and the way we rear animals and feed animals, 80% of the agricultural land is used just to feed animals. And another really important issue and a problem we have is that we do waste a lot of food. Third of the food produced for human consumption is wasted. And that's again, a big a problem that we have when you consider that we have almost 800 million people who go hungry every day. Looking at other aspects of the challenge, particularly in terms of health and nutrition, you can see that we have 864 million people who have experienced severe food insecurity. It means they are going without food for one day or more. And we also have a problem with healthy diets. Almost a third of the global population can't afford the cheapest healthy diet. And when we look also at obesity against that figure of hunger, 1.2 billion people, particularly adults, are expected to be obese by 2030. At the moment, we have around 2 billion people who are obese or overweight. And even by 2030, looking at how the trend is going, we'll still have around 600 million people who will still be facing hunger, and half of them will be in Africa. So you can see the contradictions and the challenges are just huge. If we look again at the complexity of the system we're dealing with, the food, the agriculture, it's complex. It's a globalized sector. It's complex, it's complicated, and it's influenced by so many factors. Obviously, it varies from region to region. Even within the country, we have different kind of agriculture. We have big farmers, we have smallholder farmers, we have different types of soils and climate conditions. But there are many factors that you can see there that are also impacting on the way we grow our food, move it around, and consume it. And we have our preferences as well as consumers, how we do our shopping, how we um, source our food. We have trade and international trade agreements also that affect that. And the geopolitics are also another factors, obviously, that affect the availability and the sale and access to food. So you can see that here the point I'm making is that in addition to all the challenges I showed you earlier, the environmental and the health, there are also global factors that affect the complexity and the complication of food and impact our global food security. There are also other factors that we don't actually see or talk about, and not many people are aware of that, is that there are also other hidden costs within the food that we grow and consume. And these costs are environmental, are health related, and social. And you can see there that 70% of the costs are related to our diets. Diets leading to non-communicable diseases, for instance, that cost is very high. Basically, we have a system where we grow our food to feed and nourish people, but that system is not fit for purpose because it's making people ill, basically. 70% of the costs are health related. And you can see a quarter of those costs are environmentally related in relation to the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit, the land use, deforestation, the decrease in biodiversity, soil quality, water availability, etc. And in terms of social, of course, that has an impact on our livelihoods and level of poverty and also nutrition, as I said. So you can see that the cost is huge, is around 10 trillion a year of these hidden costs. So it's not just we pay to grow and consume food, but we also pay more to deal with the consequences of how we grow and grow that food and nourish and feed ourselves. So it's very important here that we understand how we all as consumer contribute to this cost. That's very important. The cost in terms of in contribution to climate change and also the impact it has on the health of our ecosystems and our health as consumers. And there is another aspect in terms of climate finance and investment in agriculture. The agri-food systems, unfortunately, they receive very little in terms of global climate finance. It's about 4%. And when we see how much of that actually reaches the smallholder farmers, the family farmers, is less than 1%. So you can see in terms of support, again, there is another contradiction there that, we rely, of course, on food for our lives and livelihood, and yet we are not investing enough really to make sure that we address these challenges that I mentioned. We need to increase this significantly if we want really to make this system more sustainable and more resilient to these crises and shocks that I mentioned. And we need to put enabling policies in place that can help attract investment and can help see the value of food and agriculture and farmers and support them also financially. Now, overcoming these challenges, there are many things that we can do. There are many things that government and other players can do. We need to transform our agri-food systems. As I showed you, they are not fit for purpose. They need to be feeding and nourishing people, and yet they are causing hunger and biodiversity degradation, climate change, obesity. There are so many problems that we need to fix. We need to build systems that are based on sustainability, resilience, and they allow everyone everywhere to have access to food. And as I showed you earlier, there are many international agreements and pledges and commitments, but we need to translate these into some positive changes on the ground. Otherwise, we are not going to see any improvement in the situation. It's very easy, in a sense, to make pledges, but they have to translate into a meaningful improvement in people's lives. And also, that means that in national policies of governments, um, these policies, they have to integrate the agri-food systems, which means governments have to be more specific of how they're going to tackle these problems related to food security, what they're going to do about climate change, about biodiversity loss, and other aspects. And I'll come back to the nationally determined contribution, national adaptation plans, and also the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. These are all important in terms of government saying, how they're going to tackle these issues. We also need clarity going forward. We need a clear roadmap that shows what are the key pathways that the world need to look at, that the government need to address by 2030 and 2050 to address these crises and global food security. And of course, we can't make these changes and achieve this transformation without attracting and de-risking investment. And here again, we need to have enabling policies that can give confidence to investors to come in and invest. The same we saw happen in the energy transition. We need to do the same kind of incentives to decarbonize our agri-food systems and make them more sustainable and resilient. Now, if you see what's happening around the world in terms of hunger, unfortunately, hunger is on the increase. We have about 733 million people who still go hungry every day, and that's 1 in 11 people globally. And when we look at the African continent, it's 1 in 5 people in Africa. So we still have a big problem in trying to address hunger because we have food to feed everyone on the planet. And yet we have millions, hundreds of millions of people who go hungry every day. And as I said, it's not just about hunger, it's malnutrition as well. You can see the average here of malnutrition between 2021 and 2023. The figures show you the distribution of this malnutrition around the world. But the point to take from here is that in addition to hunger, we have malnutrition as well, all around the world. And that's something that we need to fix as well. So when we think about feeding a growing population, it's not just feeding people, it's having a food that is also nutritious. And there are many drivers, unfortunately, to this hunger and malnutrition. Conflicts have increased in the last 2 decades, and that's causing hunger and malnutrition, people not having access to food, and the fields, agricultural fields that have been destroyed because of the conflict activities, people being displaced from their lands and going somewhere else. Climate change, I showed you the impact of that. Many countries also face economic difficulties, and also the ability to offer to afford healthy diets. A third of the global population can't afford a healthy diet, and that's a huge problem. And the other issue that we have is inequality. We still have inequality in terms of income and poverty, and the fact that, as I said, we do have food to feed everyone, and yet it's not reaching everyone. So, to sum up, these factors here, we do have a clear goal to end hunger and malnutrition by 2030, but we are not on track to achieve that, unfortunately. We still have a lot to do, really, to fix all the problems that I mentioned earlier. So here I just want to highlight also the food that we depend on and how we grow it. I just want you to think, take 20 seconds or so and think who else is so critical in the food that is available to us and we're consuming. You might think, of course, farmers, the land, the water, etc. But think beyond that and just write it down. Who else you think is really so critical, but is almost invisible and we don't think about it much? You have a clue in this slide here, if you look at that. But beyond just the technology and the land and the people, there are others who are also so critical in having this food available to us. That's the pollinators. It's so critical because 1/3 of the global food production relies on these pollinators, bees and butterflies and birds and insects. So we should not underestimate that. It's so critical. We need to think about preserving our ecosystems, restoring degraded land and ecosystems, and increasing biodiversity because unfortunately we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And there is so much food that we won't be able to enjoy if we don't have these pollinators. And if you just look at the comparison here between, the amount of food and fruits that we would have with bees and without bees, who are critical to pollination. So this is just to highlight how complex the agri-food system is and the different players that are needed to have the food available to us and we can enjoy it. And we need to think about the ecosystem as a whole, everyone who's involved in this. Another aspect, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, is that we still waste too much food. I mentioned this earlier, but just give it again a very short thought in terms of how much food do you think we waste? How much, the global food that is produced for us to enjoy, how much of it do we throw away? Just write it down. Just have a go because this is really important. It's a trend that's been going on for a while and we still haven't fixed it. And it doesn't make any sense that we have 733 million people who go hungry every day, and then we throw in so much of the food away. It just doesn't make any sense. And we really have to fix that. So the third of the food that is produced for our production, our consumption, is wasted. And you can see the costs associated with that. And again, in the context of climate change, that's responsible for about 7 or 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These are huge. And we say that if waste were a country, it would be the third emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not something to underestimate. And there's so many things, again, that we need to fix. The point I'm making here is you can see there's so many factors, but there are also things that we can do as consumers, as society, to avoid this problem of food insecurity and people who still go hungry around the world. Food inequality is a big issue as well. Again, food is not distributed equally so that everyone can have access and enjoy it and having it at affordable prices as well. So food inequality is another issue that we need to address. In terms of food waste, there are many countries who have put laws in place to address this, which is really encouraging. And many other countries, of course, need to do the same. We need to have a global effort on food waste because it's something that we can tackle and we should. So you can see examples there of France, Italy, South Korea, and others. They put law in place basically to forbid supermarkets and businesses and others from throwing food away, and instead having collaboration with charities and others to donate that food so that people can um, enjoy it rather than throw it in landfill, and it will lead to pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and others. Because also when we throw food away, we don't just destroy or waste the food. We waste the water, the energy, the nutrient, the effort, everything that went into consuming that. And we have to stop throwing food away. It's immoral, really, given that there are millions of people who go hungry. Now, looking forward and looking again at these challenges and how we take this forward, looking into the future and the fact that we do have a growing population and we expect around 9 to 10 billion by 2050. If we want to feed and nourish everyone by then, we need to double food production. And you can imagine with that the impact that would have on natural resources, on our land, on water, so that's why I highlighted some of the issues like food loss and waste. We need to tackle those things, and we don't need to double food production. We need to look first as how efficient our system is and make it more efficient. There is a lot of wastage. We need to deal with those first. So it's important that we bear that in mind when we're thinking about feeding a growing population, because doubling food production, it's not going to be the answer going forward. There are many things that we need to fix so we can make our food production more efficient, sustainable, and resilient. So it's not vulnerable to the impact of climate change and other crises. So if we want to deal with hunger and climate change and biodiversity loss, all these goals, we need to change the way we grow and consume our food. We need to transition the system towards sustainability and towards resilience. And we have to look at different aspects of the system so that we're maximizing the synergies and the connection between land and water and energy um, and food, and then avoid trying to fix a problem here and create another one somewhere else. And we have to turn this around by looking at agriculture as not just the problem, but look at it as a solution. Because agriculture has a lot to offer, as I showed you, a huge potential to reduce greenhouse gas emission. A third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the agri-food systems. Food loss and waste, consumption of water, energy, etc. There are many aspects that we can use them to offer solutions to these crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and others. And of course, we need to make it attractive for investors to come in. We need to put policies in place that can give confidence to investors to come in and invest in innovative solutions, in drought-tolerant crops, in other types of food going forward. And of course, we have to stop wasting food. There are some encouraging international developments in terms of international policy and agreement, which is good, which is really encouraging. And I'll give you some examples here. At the last conference of the parties, COP28 on climate change in UAE, in Dubai, last year, we had this leaders declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action. Is the first ever declaration. Why is this important? Because the first time we have a recognition that we do have a problem with our food systems and we need to fix them. So it's really a very welcome political recognition. And it shows that there is a growing recognition, a growing political will and commitment that we need to look at our agri-food systems in the context of global food security and addressing the crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And it's a good step going forward in achieving what I was saying about resilient and sustainable agri-food systems. And again, what this does is that emphasize the point I made earlier about looking at the agri-food systems as solutions to these crises, because there is a lot we can do to turn this around and provide solutions rather than just continuing to talk about problems, because we know what the problems are and we know what the solutions we need to put in place. What is lacking is deploying the solutions fast and at a much higher scale. Another example, again, particularly this one at the G20 level, where we have Brazil who had the presidency and they created the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. And the aim is again to recognize the problem and to help accelerate the actions, the policies that we need to put in place to end hunger, poverty, and deal with inequalities as well. So these initiatives, they're very important because they're global. They bring in the global community together to recognize that we do have a problem as a global community and the fact that we need to work on it together. We need to collaborate together to put policies and regulation and measures together to address them as a global community going forward. So all these international initiatives, they're really important from that point of view because it brings those decision makers, the politicians, to recognize and to put enabling conditions in place to again try to find solutions going forward. And that's critical if we want to see the change happening. So I mentioned the transformation of agri-food systems. We need to do that. We need to change that because we cannot continue business as usual for all the reason I mentioned earlier, all the challenge and the consequences that these food systems are having on our life and on the environment. We need a new system that can reward regenerative agriculture, that can reward the protection of biodiversity, of our climate, and that can reward the provision of nutritious food to people. So the system that we have that just looks at food production, it's not working for the various reasons that I showed earlier. So it's really encouraging that we have this international recognition that cascades down into national policies to address these issues. And particularly this year, we have three major UN conferences that look at the biodiversity, climate change, and desertification and land degradation. And all these conferences, they are looking at food and agriculture. And it's really encouraging to see this happening. What we need going forward is a coherence in addressing this issue and the global food security at large. We need interconnection between these initiatives and what is asked of countries to provide and put in place. But it's great to see that the food and agriculture issues have reached this level of international recognition and it's now present at different international fora. And it's really some good progress to build on going forward. We need speed and scale to go forward to see the change happening. But it is really good that we do have this recognition. Now, in terms of policy instruments and how can we achieve this change, these are some of the terms some of you may be familiar with. If you're not familiar with them, what this means is these are some of the instruments or policies that countries need to come up with to say how they're going to tackle climate change, how they're going to deal with adaptation to climate change, how they're going to deal with biodiversity loss. So you must have heard of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, for instance, or the NBSAPs for biodiversity. Just in the case of NDCs, these are very important in addressing climate change and food security and other aspects and challenges that the countries are facing. Because these are national plans, if you like, that the countries need to come up with to be more specific about what they're going to do. And it's important because if you look at the timeline, and I mentioned the Paris Agreement before, and the NDCs are really important because next year, all countries need to come up with their NDCs, their national plans, but these have to be more ambitious because at the moment, unfortunately, they're still weak. They are still put all together, all countries. They are not going to allow us to stay below 1.3 degrees C to avoid the danger of climate change. And for instance, all the impact I showed you on food and agriculture and our global food security. So there is a big opportunity here to come up with something stronger, to show bigger ambition, a bigger action, a clarity on policies that government will put in place to get us towards sustainable and resilient agri-food systems. And as you can see there, next year, next February in particular, is critical because that's the deadline when countries need to submit that. This is done every 5 years. You can see in the graph there, 2030, again, we need the new updated NDCs. The aim is to reach net zero by 2050. We can only get there if we make deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and put policies in place that clarify what country is going to do to reduce these emissions and adapt to the impact of climate change. And I said at the moment, unfortunately, the ambition is still low and we are not on track to stay below the 1.5 degrees C. So these policy instruments are really important. And some of you may be familiar with this. They're discussing international negotiations on climate change. And NDC is their instrument that can allow countries to be more specific about food and agriculture and how they're going to transition into sustainable and resilient systems and attract investment. And at the moment, we're not there yet. We don't have that level of detail in the NDCs. But going forward, that's what we need. Now, ensuring food security means there are so many things that we need to look at together, because what I showed you earlier is the complexity of the agri-food systems and how there are so many factors involved. There are so many drivers. So this means that the climate change, biodiversity loss, we need to look at our consumption habits as well and diets. We need to look at innovation, not in terms of technology, but innovation in our policy making as well, innovation in finance, and also innovation in institutions that we need to put in place to make sure that we have sustainable systems going forward. And I mentioned, of course, the food loss and waste. So there are multiple challenges that we have to look at together. And this is important really because we cannot look at climate change in isolation, biodiversity loss in isolation, healthy diet in isolations. They're all interconnected and we need to look at them together. What this means is that when governments are making strategies, for instance, and policies, they have to be connected. We cannot make a strategy on water that is different to the strategy on land, different to the strategy on food, different to the strategy on energy, strategy on poverty, etc. They have to be interconnected. Otherwise, they will not work. We cannot work in silos. We have to work together and see a world as an entity of interconnected entities. And we have to do that. Otherwise, we continue working in isolation. We will not fix the problems. I remember what I said. We are not on track to achieve the climate goal and the sustainable development goals in general. So here I just want to ask you this question about from what you heard, what you learned today. So what does the future of food mean to you? Next question, next slide is the one that I will finish with, but there are a few points that I want to make before going into that slide. But what you've heard today, I took you through a journey of a big picture and challenges and so many contradictions we still have in our agri-food systems, and the fact that there's so many things that we still have to fix. And I showed you also the international efforts, and that means that there are many responsibilities. It is the international community who's coming together to address these challenges and have agreements and make commitments and pledges. And I showed you also that as consumers, we also have a role to play, and how we interact with food and environment is very important. Because at the end of the day, we are the ones who use natural resources. We have demands on food, on water, on energy, the way we want to move around, use transport, etc. So, how do we see the future now that you learned about all these challenges and problems and contradictions that we have and what we can do about them? But just from your point of view, from your perspective, just give it a short thought and maybe write something down if you want. How do you see the future of food? What does it mean to you? What does it entail? What is it that should happen really to make sure that we have a food system that is fit for purpose? We grow food to feed and nourish people while protecting the environment and biodiversity. And also, you can think a bit further and think about what is it that you can do as an individual? Because we all can do things, even though it's small, it can make a big difference. So, how do we purchase our food? How do we grow our food if you have a garden or a farm or how do you change certain things based on what you heard and if you want to make a difference? So I thought just to park here and get you to reflect before I move on to the next slide. And feel free to write something down if you want, a word or two, or something that you see now is really important for the future of our food. So to move into the next slide, the future of our food, I think is going to involve obviously a lot of innovation. As I mentioned earlier, innovation not just in technology, but innovation of how we put policies in place to make sure that we produce food that is accessible and affordable to everyone, and also kind to the environment and natural resources. And also innovative and creative in terms of diversity of our food. Because at the moment, we consume a very limited amount of food in terms of types of food. Half of the world food supply still rely on three types of food: wheat, maize, and rice. And yet we have a big variety of food to benefit from. So we have to diversify our food intake as well. And this is really very important in terms of resilience to these shocks that I mentioned. Having a diverse food supply would make us more resilient and not to rely only on three crops that, if they are ravaged by the impact of climate change or by a conflict that we saw, the war in Ukraine and the supply of wheat in so many countries that depend on that, and also the supply of fertilizers, then we have a problem and we realize that we are very vulnerable and we are not resilient at all. So diversifying our food supply can help become more resilient. And in terms of transformation, I mentioned earlier, which is critical, we have to transition into a different system. That means that we need to do things at different levels, the institutions, at the way we grow and produce food, but also us as consumers. And also we have to shift away from a system that is heavily industrialized and uses a lot of resources in general, not in an efficient way, into practices that are regenerative, that are taking into account the quality of the soil and environment and the water, and reward biodiversity and a diversity of food production as well. And of course, we need to have policies in place that can help with this transformation. For example, at the moment, governments around the world spend about 500 billion a year on agricultural subsidies, and these are harmful to the environment. So why not repurpose the subsidies, put them somewhere where they can benefit farmers and biodiversity and soil quality? Then we can help with this transformation and preservation of the ecosystem that we need to grow our food. And also, our choices are very important. We need to make choices that take into account the long-term perspective, aiming for sustainability and resilience, as I said, and look into our diet and what we consume and how much impact does that have on our health and on the environment. So you can see it's important to have a reflection of how we see the future of food going forward and start acting on it from now, on the things that we can do to make sure that we achieve that. And one of the simplest things that we can do is cutting food loss and waste as a start. And in addition to our dietary habits as well, they are quite linked. Just to think about not throwing food away and think about the millions, hundreds of millions of people who go hungry every day and the impact this is having on our environment and the overlapping crises that I mentioned earlier. All these things makes us think about, we cannot continue in this way. We have to do things differently. We have to think about a new model that can allow us to grow food and consume food in a way that is sustainable and inclusive, that everyone can have access to food and can afford food and can afford healthy diets. So the aim really is to build agri-food systems that are sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And all the parameters and the factors I showed you earlier, they are part of this goal to move into agri-food systems that are based on this sustainability and resilience going forward. And just to finish, I want to emphasize the fact that our choices matter as consumers in terms of our preferences and our expectations, because the health of the environment, the basis of our food production, um, it's linked to our health. Our demands have changed. Demands are increasing in terms of food availability and food choices and food types that we would like to see. But if we don't have a healthy environment, and if we don't have a healthy biodiversity, then our health will be impacted by that as well. So demanding healthy and sustainable food means that we also have to ensure that we have a healthy environment and healthy ecosystem that can provide us not just with food, but healthy food. And at the end of the day, if we think about having a diet that is good for us and good for the planet, that's where we want to be. Because it's not just simple to think about what we want and the food we want to have available. It's to think about where does food come from and where does it end up if we don't use it, and think about the ecosystem as a whole. So I hope that I've given you a tour of the big picture on the challenges facing global food security, and also the various efforts happening at the global level, and some of the factors that are important going forward in achieving global food security. Um, the aim was for you to take away some of this and hopefully make you think about how serious this is and the fact that we're not on track to achieve these goals. Unfortunately, there is a lot to do, and we all have to take part, make efforts, small or big, to help us achieve this goal. Because access to food is a human right. You know, everyone needs to have access to food. And it's not acceptable that in the 21st century, we still have 730 million people who go hungry every day. And then we have many contradictions in the system in terms of impact on climate change, impact on the environment, biodiversity, and the health, our health. So it's important that we really think about this going forward. And I hope that you've got now more ideas and more information to help you decide and take into account some of these factors. And please share with your colleagues as well, with your family, have a discussion about these challenges facing us. It's important that we take part and do our part in making this difference and engaging with the policymakers as well and your politicians in holding them accountable um, towards what the world is aiming to achieve so that we can all achieve a sustainable and resilient future and global food security. So thank you very much. And now I look forward to any comment, any questions. Really very much looking forward to that. So thank you very much. And back to you, Tulika.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zitouni, for such a wonderful session. I'm sure all the participants are they are having a lot to think now. And just a thought here, what I think, Dr. Zitouni, that we all are somewhere contributing to this in to making it worse, in making it worse in some or the other way. Because knowingly or unknowingly, maybe we are not knowing that the kind of day-to-day life we are living, and the kind of expectations we are having nowadays, having more and more fancy restaurants, making food more and more fancy rather than nutritious. I think we are contributing to it. So maybe we all should think and do something about it. And as you rightly said, food wastage is one of the most important aspect of this entire situation. Yeah. So we are we would just take some of the questions here, Dr. Zitouni. Uh,
Sure.
so This is Gajraj Yadav is the name, and what he's asking that how can we efficiently integrate agri-food systems into national policies and create a clear roadmap to achieve sustainable resilience and inclusivity by 2030 and 2050.
Yeah, well,
So
thank you
did
very
you?
much for the question. Yes, that's very critical, really, as I showed in my lecture. We need to integrate these systems into national policies. What that means in practice is there are tools like the NDCs that I mentioned. Government know the timeline that they need to produce that by February next year. There needs to be really discussion and coordination between the different ministries in a government to make sure that they are more specific about integrating food and agriculture into those. What that means is it's not enough just to say, okay, in our um, national plan, we recognize the importance of food and agriculture. That's not enough. You have to go beyond that. What does that mean? For example, we might say, we recognize the importance of food and agriculture, and for us, water scarcity, for instance, is really important. We want to invest in drip irrigation or in efficient use of water, preservation of water sources, etc. And therefore, we want to put these policies and regulation in place to achieve that. And we want to attract investment to build uh, in, to build, reservoirs or other means that can allow us to store water, for instance. So we need to be more specific about that, and we're not seeing that at the moment, unfortunately. So there are means, but there needs to be, the discussion internally between ministries to be more specific about what needs to be achieved. And I think to achieve that also, there needs to be discussions and consultations beyond just government, because as I showed you, there are many actors involved. If you want to attract investment, there needs to be dialogue between policymakers and investments on what the government expect and what investors expect, and put that clarity going forward. So really, unless you have that, then it's just going to stay generic and it's not going to lead to the change we want. So my point is be specific about food and agriculture in the national plans.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, Dr. Dada. Now, the other question you can also see in Q&A section is Dr. Suhas is asking, what are the initiatives of FAO for facing challenges in food security?
Well, there are many initiatives that the FAO is putting in place. Many initiatives by the UN system in general related to food and agriculture. There is World Food Day every year. There is Environment Day where there is awareness being raised about these initiatives. So, for example, um, there are initiatives on reducing food loss and waste between FAO and UNEP. There are initiatives about One Health that also shows the connection between our health, the health of the environment, and the health of animals, and the fact that they are interconnected. There are other initiatives also to do with the promotion of sustainable agriculture, particularly smart, climate smart agriculture. And these include engaging with farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, and helping them understand the challenges that I mentioned, and helping them also to have access to climate finance from the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. So there are many initiatives in this direction. The point I made earlier is we're not lacking initiatives. There are many initiatives, there are many pledges being also put forward, as I showed you from the last COP and at the G20 level. What is lacking is the speed and the scale because all the initiatives and everything we're doing, we're still behind. We're still not on track to defeat hunger and poverty and tackle climate change. So that's the bottom line, actually. So initiatives are there, they're not lacking, and I'm sure there will be more. But we really need to focus more on implementing those initiatives at larger scale. For example, if we have some initiatives that involve 3 or 5 countries, it has to be made so that it can benefit everyone, other countries. Why just 3 or 5 countries? So there are various initiatives, that's my point. But we need to think more about translating those initiatives, those commitments into a faster impact on the environment.
Thank you, Dr. Sohat, for your question. Another question which we can see in Q&A, Dr. Dada, is from Asra Muzaffar. She says, what strategies can be implemented to qualify and reduce the hidden costs of global agri-food system?
That's a good question. Thank you. And as you saw in the slide, I showed you the hidden cost of our food, and it's alarming. It's about 10 trillion a year, and their environmental, health, and social impact. So they're very serious. Strategies with the first one is to make consumers aware of those costs, and also government and everyone involved in the whole chain of food production aware of those. And the strategy should also include starting with those low-hanging fruits that we can fix to reduce those costs. So we see the cost on the environment, and I mentioned before the third of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from the way we produce and consume foods. We have to look at that so that we don't have that amount of impact. So the strategy has to identify where we need to act and start at least with those low-hanging fruit to improve the situation. What this means also is we really need commitment. We need political will also to help drive that forward. And the strategy should also recognize the fact that this is complex. It's not easy to do, but we have to start somewhere. We cannot just continue like that. These hidden costs are so large and damaging that we can't just ignore them. They can't just be hidden. We have to bring them to the front and we have to deal with them. So, in my opinion, any strategy has to deal with that. Start somewhere, recognize the fact that there are hidden costs and we have to reduce them. We have to. And there are many things there that we can do to reduce that, as I mentioned, with the diets, shifting diets and also reducing food loss and waste and efficiency in input into farming that can also reduce emissions and impacts on the environment. And as I mentioned also earlier, in terms of strategies, it has to be in connection with other strategies as well. So strategy on hidden costs, but there are other strategies trying to deal with like restoring ecosystems and biodiversity and addressing climate change, water scarcity in other areas. So not to forget about the fact of things being interconnected. And I insist on that because I know that dealing with things in isolation and in silos is not going to solve the problem.
Thank you for your question, Asra. It's another question, Dr. Dada, here is from Chandrasekhar. He says, will vertical farming be a solution to this problem?
Sorry, say that again.
He's asking, will vertical farming be a solution to this problem?
Farming. I didn't hear this very well.
Vertical farming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, I think that there are many practices like that that can be seen as a solution. The important aspect here is not to give the impression that there is one type of farming that is going to work across the board. Excuse me. Because um, because there are differences between countries and farming, even within countries, there are different circumstances that they have to be taken into account. So even though you have a practice that it looks promising, it has to be proved as where it can be most effective and not to think that it's going to work across the board. You have to take into account differences in circumstances in countries and also environmental conditions, the soil type, etc. But the main thing is to promote practices like these where actually they're most effective. You know, the whole climate smart agriculture has many practices on mitigation and adaptation, food production and resilience, but it has to be adapted to the local circumstances and to see if that kind of farming practice is going to work there or not. So it's very important to do that. You can highlight all kinds of practices, but it doesn't mean that you can just go and apply them everywhere. And we know that there are differences, of course, in the capacity of countries and farmers and the land that farmers have as well and what they're capable of producing.
Thank you, Anurag. Chandrasekhar, for your question. Another question quickly from Anurag, Dr. Dada. He asked, so why WTO discouraging subsidies in agriculture in South Asian nations? I don't know.
New business model going forward. So those subsidies, they can be better redirected into something that can benefit the farming, that can benefit farmers, and also the whole biodiversity and climate agenda in increasing biodiversity, improving water quality, and tackling climate change. So it doesn't make any sense that on one hand, I showed you how much little finance goes to agriculture, how much support goes to farmers, especially for that finance. Less than 1% reaches smallholder farmers. All the you know the impact we have in terms of hunger and obesity. So it doesn't make sense to have that all that on one hand, and on the other hand, we're spending money that goes in the opposite direction of achieving the objectives of climate change, biodiversity loss, sustainability. It doesn't make sense. So we need to redirect it. We need repurposing of those policies, going into one goal, one direction to put all those efforts and resources to achieve that. It doesn't make sense to say we have a global goal of staying below 1.5 degrees C to avoid the danger of climate change, and yet we're investing somewhere where it's causing the degradation of ecosystems, increasing emissions. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm not familiar with the point you made on WTO, and I'm not sure I understood that. But the thing about subsidies is, again, one issue that we need to tackle going forward. So we're not talking about removing them, is repurposing them, is putting them somewhere which it can go in the same direction as the goals and policies so it can help us achieve them and not go into the opposite direction.
I hope, Anurag, you got the answer. Thank you for your question. He's also saying that is food processing can be tracked for tackle global hunger? Uh,
Food
I,
processing.
yeah, I don't know uh, what exactly he's trying to say here. Food processing can be tracked with global hunger.
Don't
You
understand the
understand the
question.
question, even yeah.
Yeah,
So,
please rephrase it. Be happy to answer it if you rephrase it.
yeah. So this is Shiva Kumar. He's asking, given that the World Bank commodity markets outlook projects, this is in a Q&A section. If you can see this, Dr. Dada, he's saying that uh, Masters Outlook projects a 4% decrease in agricultural commodity prices in 2025. What factors are contributing to this decrease, and how has food price inflation managed to exceed overall inflation in 59.8% of the 164 countries where data is available? What implications do these trends have for global food security? Yeah. So did you get the question, Dr. Zitouni?
I
So you
can
can
see it's
also,
very long question.
yeah, yes.
Very long question.
Okay, so we can
I
quickly take
think
in that.
we
Yeah,
see, yeah, we see these trends in global food security. Obviously, if you remember the factors that I showed earlier, including in the conflicts, but also in the extreme weather events and geopolitical tensions, all of these factors are part of the trend that we see on prices of commodities. And we've seen that, as I said, after the war started in Ukraine, even at the COVID-19 pandemic, also we've seen trends in the availability of food and prices changing. And I mentioned earlier also the latest impact of weather event that impacted the yield of some crops like olives and affected the prices of olive oil. So, you see a decrease and increases there, but there are various factors contributing to that. The main thing really is that we do see these trends, and we have to learn from how the prices, food prices, price inflation changes, and what are the factors, and try to um, to anticipate in some cases what's going to happen based on the scenarios that we've seen before. And I mentioned the example of olive oil, for instance, but other commodities also would be affected. There are some countries where we can see the drought has been happening for the last 5, 6 years, and um, price inflation again has been affected as a result of that. So there are many things that are happening, have been happening recently, that we know they're going to happen again. And this is what the IPCC is saying, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that extreme weather event, they're going to increase in frequency and in intensity, and they're going to affect our food production, and therefore impacts on availability of food and the prices of food. So to your question here, the implication of this trend of global food security is, of course, we have to be prepared to learn from this trend and see how we can address them going forward. All the parameters I mentioned earlier in trying to build agri-food systems that are resilient and sustainable is very much part of dealing with these implications. Because when we see scenarios repeating, and we know what we need to do to reduce the risks of those, then we have the answer. And come back to my point again, we're just not implementing that fast enough. I hope that helps with answering your question.
thank you for your question, Shivkumar. Thank you, Dr. Dada. Quickly, because we are about to wind up this masterclass, so just last question I'll take here. From Abin Itani, he says, can we say that climate resilience, agriculture, and GMO high yield crop can solve global food security problem?
I wouldn't say, one thing that can solve the global food security problem is a combination of things. Um, as I showed you, food is not distributed equally everywhere. We do produce food that can feed everyone on the planet, but that's not happening. So it's good to innovate. It's good to think about other sources of food. But again, it depends on the context because we know that some part of the world consume more food than others. So I showed you the figures of hunger versus obesity, for instance. So there are some aspects related to food production, like the GMO and others that are working in some contexts. But for me, the point is to look at what we have first and make sure that we have a maximum benefit from that. So, for example, um, when I mentioned that, to feed and nourish a growing population by 2050, we need to double food production. If you look at the other information I gave you, that we do have a lot of food and we do waste a lot of it. So we need to fix those first. We don't need to cut down any more trees to grow food. We have enough land actually to grow food for everyone, but we have to do it in a more efficient way. So the answer is not to cut down more forests so we can grow more food. No, it's to regenerate the system that we have, look after the quality of our soils, the environment, and water, and provide enough food for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Arvind, for your question. So, Dr. Dada, I just from our end, I like you were part of COP29. You were at Azerbaijan just as in November itself, and you're also going to attend another conference in UAE, I think. So, what do you think? Which are the countries which are most affected, and we as an individual at the lowest level, just as the beginners, how can we contribute to save this? Just to
Yeah,
end
well,
this discussion.
we all have a
Yeah.
part to play. There's so many things we can contribute. It's very encouraging to see many countries now recognizing the fact that we do have a problem with our agri-food systems and we need to fix those problems. I just hope that that's going to happen faster and that we can put a lot of politics aside and think about actually our global food security as a priority. And if we do that, I'm sure that changes will happen more quickly. Adding also that this is not easy. The agri-food systems are complex and complicated, but we have to start somewhere because we cannot just keep ignoring all these hidden costs and all the impacts. We have to move forward. As individuals, what we do matters a lot. How we consume food, where we get our food from, how we use it matters when we have to think about that. For example, even our shopping habits, what we buy, do we buy enough just for us, or do we always end up throwing some of it away? That can be sorted easily just by getting what we need. We don't need to get a lot if we see that, now and then we end up throwing stuff away. When we go out also and eat, we have to be really sensible and considerate just you know, to to eat what we need rather than, leaving a plate half full. And there's so many occasions where we go to and you see a really nice and tasty food around the table. But after that event, a lot of it gets thrown away. I've been asking this question many events. It was going to happen to this food and say, oh, sorry, we're going to throw it away. Why? There is some food it was not touched at all. So it doesn't make sense. I think we, as individuals, as consumers, we really need to think about these things and think about the people who are hungry. And my last point is, um, for example, plastic straws. Often we go out and you want to drink. You don't need a plastic straw to drink because you enjoy that for a minute or two. And then the impact it has on the environment is huge and it stays there for so many years. So there is little things like this that we need to think about, that there are so many people that still go hungry every day, and we need to take part of the responsibility in trying to help to change this and continue engaging with politicians and others to drive this change quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Zitouni. That was a great session, and I think all we are having some more questions here, but this is about time. We are going to wrap up. Sorry, everyone. We had half an hour for this question and answer round. Maybe we can connect for another masterclass with Dr. Zitouni
With
another
pleasure.
time. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Dr. Zitouni. It was such a good session, great session, and I think we started. You're in UK, so you started the morning with the session. So yes, thanks for taking our time, and have a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope that everyone enjoyed the lecture. And I look forward to future one. I'm happy to provide any more and have more discussion with participants. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Dada. Have a good day. Thank you, everyone, for joining
Good.
us.
Thank you.
You have a
Bye.
good day.
Bye.